let's begin. This is part one of a three-part series on Torah and science. So we're going to start with probably the biggest question, biggest contradiction maybe. A lot of people think it's a contradiction between Torah and science, which is the topic of the Big Bang and the age of the universe. How old is the universe? Before we talk about that, I want to just do a little bit of an introduction about the relationship between Torah and science. Like how do these two fields really interact with each other? Because today the thinking is generally that they're somehow contradictory, that there's no way to reconcile them, that they're opposing forces. I think the image that people get is that religion is somehow against science. And also that science is against religion. But I think both of those things are actually, inaccurate, or it depends on the type of religion, at least. We're talking about, obviously, Judaism, Torah. So there isn't really there is no contradiction between Torah and science at all. And they actually support each other very nicely. If we look at some of the earlier sources, take the Rambam. So right in the beginning of his Mishnah Torah, just a little recap, the Rambam is Rabbi Moshe ben Maimonides, very famous rabbi, physician, philosopher, lived just over 800 years ago. So in his code of law, the Mishnah Torah, at the very beginning, when he talks about the mitzvah of like the foundational mitzvahs of Judaism, starting with loving God, fearing God, he says, how do we really come to love God? And he says, when one contemplates his deeds and his great and wondrous creatures, and one sees from these the wisdom of God, that it's immeasurable and unbounded, immediately he loves and praises and glorifies and has a desire to know Hashem. So the Rambam is saying he himself had a science background. He was a physician and a philosopher. So he's saying that the way you can really come to love God is by studying his work, studying what he created. That's how you come to understand him. And when you understand, when you see the wonder of creation, then you will love the creator. So I can relate to this personally because I didn't grow up religious. I became religious when I was in university studying biochemistry. That's where I was just in absolute awe of everything that I was learning, all the molecular genetics, all these incredibly complex pathways, seeing how enzymes work, and it's just unbelievable. The cell, just a single cell, a simple cell, your body is made of trillions of them. But just one cell is so complex and so amazing. It's just incredible. So by looking in science, we can actually, by studying the creations, we can come to love the creator and understand the creator. The Vilna Gaon, who lived just over 200 years ago, the great Vilna Gaon, his student quoted him as saying, to the extent that one lacks knowledge of the natural forces, he will lack knowledge 100-fold in the wisdom of Torah. So he's saying that you need to know science to understand Torah. You cannot separate these two. The Vilna Gaon, interestingly, actually was behind the first math textbook for yeshiva students. And so he had one of his disciples make a textbook for yeshivas, which back then didn't have a general studies curriculum, but the Vilna Gaon was kind of like the first person to suggest that even a yeshiva should have some secular general studies, some science, math, and not just Torah. The Maharal, who lived even before that in Prague, we should study the wisdom of the nations, for why should we not engage in wisdom that was granted by the Almighty? The wisdom of nature and its order is certainly permissible to study, for this wisdom is like a ladder with which to ascend to Torah. So again, very similar to what Vilna Gaon would say later, that we need natural science, natural wisdom to also understand the Torah. And most recently, in the previous century, the great Yemenite sage, Rabbi Yosef Kafach, he said that he actually held that it's a mitzvah. He was a Maimonidean, if we can call him that, a Rambamist. He was very much, in Yemen, the Yemenite community, most of them go very strictly according to the Rambam. So based on that. He held similar views to the Rambam, and he said that it's even a mitzvah from the Torah to study science. Specifically, he's saying it's obligatory to study science. Specifically, he's saying logic, astronomy, natural science, which includes biology, zoology, physics, medicine, language, saying these are fundamental for anybody, any Jew, any Torah scholar to study these subjects. The Rambam, just back to the Rambam for a second, he actually starts his code of Jewish law. You would think that he'd get right into Jewish law, but he actually starts by talking about science. He talks about the elements and the stars and planets, astronomy, all these things. And he says that this is really Jewish mysticism. Because when the sages talked about all these mystical concepts, he's saying that that referred to scientific matters, astronomical matters, things like that. So science and Torah are really inseparable. They go together. And if you understand science, then you can better understand the Torah. That's the idea. So not only do they not contradict, but science should help us grow in our Torah learning and our Torah understanding. It'll help us better understand the Torah. So with that little introduction, let's see what the Torah and science say about the origins and the age of the universe. So we'll start with what science says. The consensus of most scientists, all the evidence that we have to this day. What do we have? So first of all, this whole idea of a Big Bang, that we're saying that there was a beginning, and that the universe had some starting point. Might seem trivial, but it's actually a big deal, because until very recently, until the last century, most scientists just held that the universe must be eternal. It just was always here. It didn't have a starting point. Going back to Aristotle, that was the thinking, that the universe didn't have a beginning. It always existed. So with this discovery of the Big Bang, suddenly the universe has a starting point. It didn't just always exist. It had a beginning. That's a big deal. And how did it begin? It began with this tiny little point, an infinitesimally small point, which is called by scientists a singularity. Okay? Everything started with a tiny little point. And that point, for whatever reason that we don't know, had this rapid inflation, expansion. That's the so-called bang. It's not so much a bang, it's just a very rapid inflation. And this inflation was basically energy. Yeah? Some form of energy, radiation, radiant energy. That's what basically this whole Big Bang thing is. And eventually all that energy cooled, the expansion, the cooling, things separated. So you started forming the first little bits of matter. And then those formed into the first element, hydrogen. And then hydrogens collided into helium and so on. And every element was formed through the collisions of elements. So things get kind of more and more complex. But everything starts with a tiny point that has a rapid inflation of energy, radiation, light. And as it cools off, expands, cools off, things start to matter as we know it starts to form. Okay. So this is like a very famous diagram of the age of the universe. So about 13.7 billion years. For those who were with us last time, you remember the number 137? When we talked about 137. So it's here again, right? In the age of the universe, it's not a coincidence. So this is a classic diagram of the universe, the Big Bang. Whatever happened here, we don't know. It's like quantum fluctuations, whatever that is. Whatever happened before, we have no idea. And from a tiny point, you have this very rapid, very, very rapid inflation. And then since roughly the beginning, let's say not long after the beginning, the universe is still expanding, but not as much. And here we are at the end of this little, whatever you want to call it, column. How do we know this? So the big finding happened in the 60s. Most of this was still kind of theoretical until in the 1960s, a couple of scientists, Penzias and Wilson, they saw something really strange. They saw that basically everywhere in the universe, there's this cosmic microwave background radiation. This is famous picture of that across the universe, there's this microwaves everywhere for some reason. So Brian Greene, who's a popular physicist, he writes in his book, he summarizes it pretty well. He says, if you were to shut off the sun, remove the other stars from the Milky Way, sweep away the most distant galaxies, space wouldn't be black. To us, it appears black. And to the human eye, it would appear black. But if you could see radiation in the microwave part of the spectrum, then every which way you turned, you'd see a uniform glow. Its origin, the origin. Okay? So the Big Bang. So from the very beginning, from that initial burst of light and energy, radiation, that energy is still in the universe. It's still radiating billions of years later. The universe is still glowing with that burst. And that glow is a cosmic microwave background. So Brian Greene is reminding us that we see very little, right? Your eyes, like human eyes, are have a very slim sliver of the electromagnetic spectrum. Visible light is just a tiny few hundred nanometers wavelengths. Most of the electromagnetic spectrum we cannot see. Radio waves, microwaves, infrared, and ultraviolet, and X-rays, gamma rays. We can't see these things. Some animals can, right? Like certain bees and butterflies, they can see in UV and so on. So some animals can see more. We can build machines to help us see using X-rays and things like that. But we don't see very much. God hid most of what's going on in the universe from our vision. So we only really see a tiny amount of the light that's really out there. So Brian Greene is telling us if we could see a little more, then we'd see that the whole universe, the sky is actually glowing. It's never really dark. It appears dark to us. But if we could see in microwaves, then the sky would just be glowing. Oh, here's the electromagnetic spectrum. So that's all we can see, this tiny little range. So here's your entire spectrum from radio waves, which are the longest waves, have the lowest frequency. And on the other end, gamma rays, short wavelength, high frequency, very dangerous. And those are the kinds of rays that can cause cancer and things like that. So the rays on this end are the ones that are considered dangerous, UV, X-rays, gamma rays. The rays on this end are generally not so dangerous, radio, microwave, infrared. And we just see this tiny little bit, this little bit of visible light. Everything else is, we're blind to all these other things that are happening all around us. So now what does the Torah say? So we know what science says. The universe is glowing. There's the afterglow is still there. We can detect it. Right? So it's not just like some people like to say that the Big Bang, oh, it's just a theory, you know, it's just an idea. It's not just a theory. We have really good evidence for it. This is just one. This is probably the main bit of evidence, but there's other things as well. And it works really well mathematically too. So it's in science, when we say something's a theory, it's very different than when we say in general, you know, colloquial speech, oh, it's just a theory. When we say that, we really mean it's just a hypothesis, maybe. So a hypothesis is like an idea, but a theory is something that's very deeply supported by a lot of evidence. So the Big Bang is not just a theory. I mean, it is a theory, which means that it's heavily supported by all kinds of empirical evidence. So the universe had a beginning, started from a tiny point called the singularity. The point expanded for whatever reason, we don't know why, but it expanded very rapidly. There was this burst of light, glow, and now here we are, 13.7 billion years later. So what does the Torah say? Let's look at a couple of verses from the Tanakh. Eov, Job. Remember Job? Remember Job? So it says in Eov, Ve'ata lo or bahirhu bashchakim. He's saying that people, the general theme, one of the key themes of the book of Job is how man's vision is very limited, not just physically, but I mean spiritually, right? Job thought God was punishing him unfairly and so on and so on. And then God came to him and reminded him how little he actually knows. You know, you're one human being in this big world and an even bigger universe. How much do you really know? Our knowledge and understanding and what we can see is very tiny. So as part of that theme, it says in Eov, now, ata with an ayin, people don't see, they don't see the light, bahirhu bashchakim, which is actually very bright in the skies. There's a bright light in the sky that we cannot see, that human beings cannot perceive. So keep in mind what Brian Greene said about the light in the skies, okay? The light that we cannot see. If we could see in microwaves, we'd see that glow. And Daniel, very famous verse in the book of Daniel, V'amaskilim, the wise ones, yazhiru kizoar harakia. The wise ones glow like the glow of the rakia. So we have to understand what rakia is. It's translated usually as the firmament. It's really talking about space, because when we read in Genesis, Bereshit, how God created the universe, and on the fourth day, it says that God placed, the stars and planets and all this. Where are they suspended? They are in the rakia. Okay, the rakia is outer space. The root even, rek means empty, right? So it means emptiness, right? Outer space, emptiness. Same idea, like they really mean space. We think of it as a firmament, but it's not really what the Torah is saying when it's talking about the rakia. So, v'amaskilim yazhiru ki zohar rakia, that wise ones glow like space is glowing. We don't really see space glow, not outer, not like the black. We see space as being black. We also don't see wise people glow, right? We don't see that either, right? So you would think this is being very metaphorical, but we all glow with our own various lights that emerge from us. And in the same way, space is glowing as well. Okay, so science and Torah are actually agreeing that there's this glow in the universe that most people are just blind to. The whole universe is glowing. Now let's look more specifically what the Zohar says. By the way, the Zohar, we said Yazhiru ki Zohar harakia, right? The name of the book of the Zohar, the main textbook, let's say, of Jewish mysticism, of Kabbalah, which was published for the first time by Rabbi Moshe de Leon over 700 years ago. So this is ancient wisdom that goes back to Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai almost 2,000 years ago. So the Zohar says like this. Here's the original language. The Zohar is written in Aramaic. So it says like this: B'sha'ata distima dechol stimin. When in that moment, when the most hidden one, the most concealed one, Baleit Galial, came to create, or wished to create, really. Avad bereisha nikuda chada. That first he created what? Avad bereisha. The first thing that he created, nikuda chada. Everybody knows a little bit of Hebrew. That much I think everybody knows. Nikud is a dot, a point. Chada, one. Chad. God created first a singular point. Vedasalek, and with that point, Vedasalek lemevi machshava, he brought about all thoughts. Tziyar bakol tziyurin, chakak bakol glifin. He created, everything was created out of that initial point. Verazada, and what is the secret here of the verse Bereshit bara Elokim? So the Zohar is a commentary on the Torah, right? Just a little recap. The Zohar is arranged according to the Torah portion. So it's like a very deep, it's a mystical explanation. The Sod, the secrets of the Torah. So it's arranged by the Torah. So it's right at the beginning of the Zohar. So Zohar, what is the secret of? Raza, Raza means the secret. What is the secret of Bereshit bara Elokim, the first words of the Torah? From which came all the ma'amarot, all the utterances of God. Remember, God created the world by speaking. Right? God said, Vayomer Elohim, God said, let there be light, and there was light. God said there would be, and there would be. There was 10, but God said, ma'amarot, asara ma'amarot. So all these utterances of God, everything that God created, came from itpashtuta, leitpashet, to expansion, the nikuda di Zohar, from that initial point of Zohar, of the glow. Remember the Zohar? Zohar Rakia? Space is glowing. Nikuda ishpa. So you see what's happening here? The expansion of that initial point of radiance, of glow, of Zohar. It's pretty clear that it's the Big Bang, no? It's like the same exact points. If you compare them, what does science say versus what does the Torah say? Same thing. There was a beginning, of course. It all started with a tiny point. In science, we call it a singularity. In Torah, we call it a nikuda chada, 1 point. There was a phase of expansion, inflation, in Hebrew, Aramaic, Itpashtuta, and it all started from Zohar, from radiation, glow. Same thing, no? This is the secret of what it says at the beginning. The first thing God created is light, right? Vayehi, oh, let there be light, glow. Everything came from that initial radiance. So that's on the Big Bang. Any questions about that? Are you clear? So there's no contradiction here. They're saying the exact same thing, just in different words and terminology. When did it begin? Maybe a more difficult question. So I should change the slide. It's not 5780 anymore. It's 5781. So we count from 57. Let's say our current Hebrew year is 5781. And as we saw previously, according to science, the age of the universe is 13.7 billion years. So which one is it? When did it begin? So the most important thing to understand here, I think before everything else, I mean, 5781, I think we have to establish that we count time from the start of Adam, from the creation of Adam. So from the sixth day, Adam was created on the sixth day, right? Until you had Adam, there was no need to keep track of time because only humans keep track of time. So before Adam, there was no need to track time. And also you couldn't really track time in the way we do because we're used to keeping track of time by, days, sunset, sunrise, and so on, months, moon, years. But none of that really existed until the fourth day, right? So what was the time of the first, second, and third day? There couldn't be time in the way that we perceive time or track time because there was no sun and moon or anything like that till day 4 anyways. So the time that was at the beginning in those first 6 days could not have been quite like our time. But even if it was, let's see where we're going to go with this. What you need to understand is just that we keep track of time from Adam, okay? Starting with Adam. Now, time is relative. What does that mean? If you remember Albert Einstein, everybody remembers Albert Einstein. So Albert Einstein's whole revolutionary idea was that space and time are not separate, they're not distinct entities, that time and space are like one fabric of space-time. They go together. And that gives us all kinds of funky things, making time relative, because if time is part of space, and if you warp space, then you also warp time. So if you have a big body, some huge gravitational field out in space, and it warps space, it'll also warp time. This is a big thing in science fiction movies and books. Time dilation. Anybody ever watch Interstellar? Great movie. Great movie. Everybody should watch it. It's my favorite movie. Interstellar is about exactly this. I mean, it's about saving, as always, saving the Earth that is about to be destroyed. But a group of scientists go out into space looking for a new world, and they get confronted with all kinds of time dilation as they move next to black holes and through wormholes and things like that. So what happens is time for them goes very slowly, or I guess slowly, quickly, hard to say, compared to Earth. So what happens is for them, it's only maybe been a couple hours, but back on Earth, it could be many years. This is the strange thing about time. Very hard to wrap our heads around it, but it's actually scientifically proven. So these experiments have been done by taking very precise atomic clocks and putting them in different places. You can have one on the space station, you can have one on Earth, you can have one at the top of a mountain, somewhere else, places where motion would be different, motion through space would be different. And you find that the atomic clocks run differently. They are super precise. You turn them on at the same time, but they'll actually run differently. this little formula over here, this is called the Lorentz transformation. This is how you can calculate the effects of time dilation. You plug in whatever you can do, these little numbers. C is the speed of light, V is the speed of something else. The closer you get to the speed of light, the slower time will be for you. At the speed of light, time just stops. It's like light doesn't experience time. But the closer you get to light, everything kind of slows down. So it's the Lorentz transformation. As an aside, you can use this to do a little calculation. We read in the Torah that Adam lived 930 years. And that's like a really shocking number. How could Adam have lived 930 years? So there's different ways to explain that. But I think one interesting one, probably not true, but I think it's intriguing. If you plug it in, if you put, the sages describe Adam as a being of light. The original Adam. He was so great that he was like light. The sages say that he could see from one end of the universe to the other end of the universe. He was glowing, he was radiant. So if they meant that perhaps he could somehow, being light, move at the speed of light, or close to, can't move at the speed of light, but let's say close to the speed of light. If you plug in a number very close to the speed of light here, and you compare what 930 years would be for Adam, it actually works out to something like 80 years. That like 80 years of a human lifespan, but with trips at near light speed, you could very easily live 930 years. So anybody who's interested in that, I can show you the calculations afterwards. So you can play with this formula, and I think it's one interesting way of explaining how could Adam have lived so long. And if we consider how our sages say that Adam was a being of light, I could see across space with light. What does that really mean? That he saw across space. If you could travel this fast, perhaps you could actually literally see across space. Right? You can travel through space and see the universe and age very slowly. So he could live 930 years later. But that's an aside. So if anybody is interested in that, playing with the Lorentz transformation, I can show you that another time. Okay, so time is relative. Time changes. Time doesn't stay the same. Okay. So 1 second after the Big Bang, matter began to form. 1 second after the Big Bang. Okay. And since then, the size of the universe, based on our calculations, the universe has expanded by about 1 trillion times. So originally, at 1 second after the Big Bang, its size would have been about 1 times 10 to the power of 11 kilometers. Today, it's about 8.8 times 10 to the power of 23 kilometers. You remember how to do scientific notation, right? Like the 10 to the 23 is like how many zeros you add after the decimal place. It's a very large number. So the universe has expanded by about 1 trillion times. Now, if space has expanded by about 1 trillion times, what does that mean for time? Time is not the same, right? Time is linked with space. So if space has expanded by 1 trillion times and time goes with it, time has also expanded. So the way we perceive time today is very different than time at the beginning. Okay? Like, to give you an analogy, let's say you're standing, there's 2 analogies I can give you. Let's say you have a balloon that's deflated and you put 2 points, take a marker and make 2 dots on it. And then you start blowing up that balloon. What's gonna happen to those 2 dots? Let's say you put them 1 centimeter apart when the balloon was deflated, and then you start blowing up the balloon. Those 2 dots, after you've blown up the balloon, are not gonna be 1 centimeter apart anymore, right? They're going to be very far apart. And space is constantly expanding. Even now it's expanding. Both Torah and science agreed on that everything's expanding very rapidly. There's lots of expansion. So imagine a different scenario. You shoot an arrow, and then you wait 5 seconds and you shoot another arrow. So these 2 arrows are flying 5 seconds apart. But as the universe is expanding, the space between those arrows is also expanding. So after these arrows have been flying, let's say they're flying forever, there's nothing stopping them, no friction, no air resistance. So they're flying 5 seconds apart, but as time goes on and the universe expands, the space between them expands. So after a very long time, are they still 5 seconds apart? Not anymore, right? Because space has expanded between them. Now they're 10 seconds apart. And after an even longer period of time, they're 20 seconds apart. And then they're a minute apart. And then they're an hour apart. So somebody standing at the end of the bullseye, the arrows are incoming, and the one arrow hits, and the person's tracking and saying, oh, wait, 5 minutes passed between the first arrow and the second arrow. They must have been fired off 5 minutes apart. But really, they were fired off 5 seconds apart. But it's just that as time expanded, that person's perception is a little bit off, right? It hasn't been 5 minutes, 5 seconds. You get the idea. So if time also expanded 1 trillion times, by the way, this is based on, adapted slightly from Dr. Gerald Schroeder's calculations. So I didn't invent this. I got it from Dr. Gerald Schroeder with minor tweaks in the numbers. So if time is also expanded at 1 trillion times, we said that the age of the universe, according to science, is 13.7 billion years. 13.7 times 10 to the 9. This is really bad scientific notation. If this was one of my students, I'd take off points right now. That's my mistake. It should be 1.37 times 10 to the power of 10. You can't have double digits on the left side of the decimal with scientific notation. It should be 1.37 times 10 to 10. But it's just easier to write it like that because it's 13.7 billion years. So 13.7 billion years comes out to, if you divide it by 1 trillion times, I see your question, I was just reading it. So yes, it should be the same, right? Because space and time go together. So one expands, the other one expands too. So they've both expanded by 1 trillion times.
So then why did the arrows become different amounts apart?
So that's the whole idea. That's what just give me a second. I'm going to show you how this applies to this. So those arrows were fired 5 seconds apart, and now they're 5 minutes apart because of the way that space has expanded between them.
And then
So
the time didn't expand with it?
It did. That's the whole point. Space and time both expanded, right? So the time expanded from 5 seconds to 5 minutes, and the space expanded from whatever. With that example, we don't have the exact numbers, but space expanded and time expanded. So same thing here. We know that space expanded 1 trillion times. So if time also expanded 1 trillion times, being part of the same space-time fabric, so you divide by 1 trillion. How much has time really expanded? How much time has really elapsed from the Big Bang? You have 13.7 billion years divided by 1 trillion. It's really only been, if you look at it from the beginning of time, from God's perspective, not from our perspective, looking back at an ancient universe, but from God's perspective, standing at the beginning of time, how much has it been? So 13.7 billion divided by 1 trillion, 0.0137 years. And if you want to know how many days that is, just multiply by 365, right? How many days is 0.0137 years? Is just 5 days. So we said that we count the years 5781 since Adam was created on the 6th day. So the 5 days before that, it's the same as having 13.7 billion years. Before man's perception, we human beings, Adam, looking back at time, we say, oh, look, it's 13.7 billion years old. But before Adam, those 5 previous days, from God's vantage point, it's the same as us looking back 13.7 billion years. Make sense? Now, there's another way to derive this number, which was done long time ago. So again, I didn't come up with these calculations. If you take a few verses from the Torah, it says in Tehillim and Psalms, we say this in our prayers Zachar leolam brito, davar tziva le'elef dor. That God, davar tziva, God commanded his word le'elef dor, which could be translated a couple of ways. You can either say le'elef dor means either to 1,000 generations or to the 1,000th generation. So the first interpretation is a problem because we say the Torah is eternal, that God says that I don't change. Ani Hashem lo shaniti. God says I don't change, and God is infinite, eternal. The Torah is eternal. So to say that the Torah was only commanded, God's word was commanded for only 1,000 generations doesn't make sense. It's forever, not just 1,000 generations. We always say it's leolam va'ed, it's forever. Why would it be le'elef do? So the first interpretation or translation doesn't work. The second translation is that God gave the Torah to the 1,000th generation. Which generation was the one that received the Torah? The generation of Moses. In Moses' generation, the Torah was given. So it seems like we're reading here in Tehillim that God gave the Torah to Moses, and Moses' generation was the 1,000th generation. But when you actually count, what was Moses' generation counting from Adam? So there were 10 generations from Adam to Noah, 10 generations from Noah to Abraham, that's 20, and 6 generations from Abraham to Moses, that's 26. Number 26, the number 26, that's the numerical value of God's name, right? Yud He Vav He is 26. So God gave the Torah to the 26th generation from Adam. So how can it say that it was 1,000th generation? So the Gemara says, Tanya, Amar Rabbi Shimon, a Chassid. So what was it really? 974 dorot. There were 974 generations. Shekomtu leibarot kodem shenivra haolam. There should have been 974 generations before Adam. So here there's this idea that there were 974 generations of some sort before Adam. Not physical generations of people, because that only started with Adam, but there were 974 generations before. Yeah, very interesting, puzzling statement. Very different explanations for what that means, different interpretations for what that means. But there's this teaching, this tradition that there were 974 generations before, based on Tehillim, based on what scripture says, that if the Torah was given to the 1,000th generation, but we see that Moses' generation was only the 26th generation, then therefore, 1,000 minus 26, there must have been 974 generations before. And how long is a generation? Well, throughout the Torah, generations always set us 40 years. For example, is one place that God led us in the wilderness, Bamidbar, 40 shana, 40 years, ad tom kol hador, till the end of that generation. That a generation is 40 years. So you have 974 generations, and each generation is 40 years. And then Tehillim also tells us that generally, elef shanim be'enecha keyom etmol, that 1,000 years for humans is like a day in the heavens. So for us, 1,000 years past, in the heavens, it's like a day, like a passing day. So if you put all these numbers together, there was 974 generations before Adam. Each generation's 40 years. You have 365 days per year, and 1,000 human years is equal to 1 day, 1 divine day, 1 heavenly day. That gives you 14 billion years. So very close to that number, to 13.7 billion. So just doing a little bit of playing with verses from the Torah, if this is the case, then that and this and that, and put them all together, you get the same number. That the universe is billions of years old. Roughly the same as the scientific estimate, 13.7. So you can go about it this way, with a more kind of physics basis. You can go about it just strictly from taking some verses from scripture, from the Talmud. There's another way to do this too, which is this Rabbi is Rabbi Arya Kaplan, very famous, Rabbi Arya Kaplan. Probably one of the greatest geniuses in the last century, unfortunately passed away too young in the 80s. Not in his 80s, in the 1980s. He was very young. But he, despite being so young, he actually wrote a tremendous amount of material. So highly recommended to read all of his books. Just read them all. Get the Arya Kaplan anthology, start to finish. You want a good introduction to Jewish mysticism, read his translation of Sefer Yetzirah with commentary. Yeah, Arya Kaplan, great figure. So Rabbi Arya Kaplan also wrote a book called Kabbalah and the Age of the Universe, where he explores all these things. A lot of these numbers come from that book. And it says in Kohelet Rabbah, in the Midrash, HaKadosh Baruch Hu boneh olamot u'machriban. It's a very famous statement. It appears in other places too, that God, before he created this world, would create and destroy other worlds. Before God created this world, he destroyed and created other worlds. The way I like to understand this one is a little bit differently. Just want to share it with you because I think it's really interesting. If you think about, based on science, where did all the material on Earth come from? Like, you're all probably wearing some gold jewelry or something right now, maybe your wedding ring or whatever. Where did that come from? Where did that gold come from? Like, yeah, it was mined out of the earth, but how did it get to the earth? So the scientific answer is that all these heavy elements were generated in stars, in exploding stars. And like, our sun is a ball of hydrogen, and the hydrogen fuses into helium, and that fusion releases lots of heat and light. And it's going to keep fusing elements like that, and eventually it'll start fusing into metals. You'll make lithium, and then beryllium, and boron, and carbon, and so on, and so on, and so on. And it keeps going, you know, all the way to iron, which we mentioned last time is the most stable of the nuclei of the metals, the most abundant metal in the universe. And then eventually when stars explode, there's even more pressure and heat and even more fusion. So these exploding stars generate even heavier elements like gold and silver and things like that. And there are these clouds, these supernovas, clouds of dust, of metals flying through space. And then eventually they coalesce and come together again and form new planets. So the scientific theory, hypothesis, whatever you want to call it, explanation for how Earth was formed, it's from the destruction of previous worlds, previous stars that exploded and then came together again to form our planet. So the gold that you are wearing was once in some exploding star. It's pretty crazy, right? Like we all hear these cliche statements that like human beings are like stardust, like you're like a star. It's like a cute statement, but it's true. It's true. You are made of the matter that makes up your body, made up a star at some point before 5 billion years ago, at some point when this solar system began to form. Isn't that awesome? You're made of old stardust. So when God tells Abraham that, remember God told Abraham that I'm going to make you like the stars and like the dust. And there's a lot, you remember that statement? So God promised Abraham that I'm going to make you as numerous as the stars and as numerous as the dust. And our sages say that it means that for us, the Jewish people, the descendants of Abraham, we have the potential to be as great as stars and unfortunately also to fall as low as dust. But I think there's also like a deeper scientific explanation there on a mystical level, that the dust and the stars, it's all the same stuff, right? The dust comes from the stars. We are dust and we are stars. We're stardust. I didn't come up with that. That's some other people say. We are stardust. Very famous statement, right? Human beings are stardust. So God told Abraham that you and your descendants are like the stars and you're like the dust, because that's really what we are. And the whole universe is really just one. It's one organism. So in mystical texts, it always talks about how the universe is like an Adam Gadol, like a big man, and every person's like Olam Katan, is a small universe. You are a little microcosm of the universe, quite literally. You know, the atoms of your body were once spread out somewhere else in some other galaxy, and you are now this like chunk of matter from across the universe. It's a really beautiful thought. So I with this statement that before God created this world, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was boneh olamot u'machriban, would create worlds and destroy them, boreh olamot u'machriban, keep creating and destroying worlds. I like to think of it as like a little support for that scientific theory, that God had to create and did create previous stars and planets and destroyed them before he created ours. But that's not what Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan was talking about. So Rabbi Aryeh Kaplan was quoting from a bunch of different sources. It appears in many ancient books, some of the most ancient mystical texts that talk about this idea of cosmic shmitot. So if you remember a shmita is the sabbatical. So every 7 years you have a Sabbath, right? We have a Sabbath every 7th day, Shabbat, and then every 7th year, God commanded that everybody should just rest for a whole year, at least rest from farming, from agricultural labor. So we rest every 7 days and then we rest every 7 years. So it's called a Shemitah. And in ancient mystical texts, it talks about how the whole universe goes through cosmic Shmitot, that the whole universe goes through cycles of 7,000 years, that we have 6,000 years of like civilization, and the 7,000th year is a Shemitah, like a rest. And then it starts again, so that humanity goes through cycles of Shmitot. So Rabbi Kaplan points out that there have been 6 Shmitot before this one, that we're in the 7th Shemitah. There's different opinions, actually. There's always different opinions, but there's different understanding of which Shemitah we are in. So according to one opinion, we are in the 7th Shemitah, which means that there have been 6 previous cycles of 7,000 years before us. And if those were, again, divine days, not like human days, but going by what we said, that 1,000 human years is a divine day. So Rabbi Kaplan comes to the same conclusion, or a similar number, that the universe is about 15 billion years old. And he actually found this number. He talks about where he got this number. He says he found it in the work of a rabbi who lived 700 years ago, whose name was Rabbi Yitzhak Deman Ako. So 700 years ago was a big mystical rabbi who was the first to actually say that the universe is about 15 billion years old. So it's amazing that a rabbi 700 years ago could already hypothesize that the universe is actually 15 billion years old. And Rabbi Kaplan actually talks about how it was very hard for him to find that manuscript, an authentic manuscript of that work of Rabbi Yitzhak Deman Ako. Very fascinating story. I think he went to Russia in some library, in some repository of antiques to find it, but he found it. So there was a rabbi already 700 years ago that was saying that the universe, it's not 5,000 whatever years old, it's 15 billion years old. So 5781, we're counting from Adam, simply from Adam, from the start of civilization, more specifically from the start of civilized man. So we'll end with that for today, and we'll continue with part 2 next time, maybe next week.